Now, if we are truly going to make Toronto a sanctuary city, we will need the cooperation of the police to do so. And one very inspiring thing about the Access to Fear campaign for me has been the success that the activists in the campaign have had in convincing the Toronto Police Services Board to sign on to this kind of idea. They've done so imperfectly, but they wouldn't have come as far as they have without the activism of many of the people who are in this room now. From its inception, the campaign with respect to the police has had a focus on the incredible need for a don't ask, don't tell policy in order to protect women, particularly who are either in or are fleeing situations of violence. And in light of, I know many of the people in the room work in that kind of area, so I'm going to direct a lot of my comments to those particular situations and the kinds of things that shelter workers find themselves facing. In light of the policy, there is in existence a policy at the board. It's important for shelter workers and other kinds of social workers who work with women and families to know what the police can do, what immigration officers can do with respect to the people that you work with. Now, I'll focus first on this issue of arrest and clarification about when a police officer can arrest somebody without status versus an immigration officer. Immigration officers have fairly broad powers to arrest with or without a warrant people for a variety of different circumstances. You should know that. Police powers to arrest for immigration reasons are more limited. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act gives them the authority to execute immigration warrants and to arrest persons at the direction of an immigration officer, but in general, it's not supposed to be a police officer's role to be policing immigration. That's the role of immigration officers. That being said, there are many, many warrants. There are many immigration warrants in the system. I saw yesterday there's a 2003 report that had the number at 36,000 in Canada, and I'm sure it's higher now. These immigration warrants are actually put into the system, into the CPIC system. So police officers have that at their fingertips. They can tell very easily when somebody has an immigration warrant. An immigration warrant is issued in circumstances where, for example, a person has failed to show up for an immigration hearing, has failed to show up just for an interview, has failed to show up for deportation. So, and many people don't know that actually there is a warrant out for them. There are thousands and thousands of them in existence. And I know warrants raise a lot of concerns and questions for people in social services. What do you do if a police officer shows up at your shelter door? What do you do if an immigration officer shows up at your door? What's the difference? It's hard to speak generally about these things because they can vary very much depending on individual circumstances, but I would just say as a general rule, if an officer, whether an immigration officer or a police officer shows up at a door and they don't have a piece of paper with them, a warrant for arrest or a search warrant, then you really don't have any obligation to speak with them about any of the people who may be in your building or obtain services from you. And I know, there are privacy laws and so on. The situation is quite different if they show up with a search warrant or an arrest warrant. And you'll want, if that happens, you'll want to look at that piece of paper very carefully. They do, in most circumstances, give the officer the authority to enter your building, which may violate many of the principles that we have about these places being safe places, about protecting women. But what often happens in these cases are police become aware, not through a warrant, but through their interactions with victims and witnesses of crime, or people just driving or just people walking down the street. They become aware of their status, their lack of status, and then take steps to take them into detention and to report them to immigration authorities. This is where the Don't Ask policy with the Toronto Police Services Board is supposed to kick into place. According to the policy, police officers are not supposed to ask to ask victims or witnesses of crime. It's limited there. They're not supposed to ask victims or witnesses of crime about their status, with a very big exception. They have what they call, they're allowed to ask about your status if they have bona fide reasons. And that's, I don't know why they use the Latin, I guess. But that just means good reasons, and they have 4 situations in which they say they are permitted to ask somebody about their a victim or witness of a crime about their status. The first is if the victim or witness may possibly require or may seek admission into the Provincial Witness Protection Program. That's very broad. I have concerns about all of these. I think they could be very easily manipulated and misused. Because certainly, isn't there the potential that any victim of a crime or witness of a crime may seek admission? They may ask. According to the policy, this would give police officers an opportunity to ask about their status. The second exception is if a Crown attorney is requesting the information for the purposes of a criminal case in a they call it for disclosure purposes, which means that if you're charged with a crime, you're allowed to have disclosure of the case against you, which usually includes police officers' notes and so on. I can't understand this exception. It doesn't make any sense to me. There's no reason why a Crown attorney would be asking for information about status. It's not relevant to virtually any criminal offense. I don't understand why that's included. The third exception is if the information is necessary to prove essential elements of an offense. So what this basically means is they're allowed to ask about your status if it's relevant to the crime. Please somebody name me a crime in which that would be relevant. The last one is one that causes me the most concern. The fourth exception is they can ask a victim or witness about their status in circumstances where it is essential to public or officer safety and security to ascertain the immigration status of a victim or witness. That's very general, it's very broad, it's open to abuse, and it plays into stereotypes about immigrants, people without status being dangerous. So needless to say, I think while it's an important step forward, there are a lot of problems that I have with this aspect of the policy. I think its protection for victims and witnesses of crime is very imperfect. Still a lot of work to do. The biggest problem that we have with the policy as it is now is that there's no don't tell aspect to the policy, which means that if a police officer receives information that a victim or witness in front of them does not have status, there's nothing to stop that. There's no don't tell. That means they can tell immigration officers, and they do so with great relish. So let's put this into perspective when we're dealing with women who are in situations of violence. I'm sure many of you have dealt with women who are in very precarious situations. They're living with violence in their home. They don't have status. Their partner does, and is holding that over their head. If you leave me, I'm going to report you to the police. If you report me to the police, I'm going to tell them you don't have status. This is a reality that many women live with every day. And this policy that we have right now does not protect those women, because once a husband is arrested for domestic violence, if he says, my wife doesn't have status, the Toronto Police Service takes the position now, they are obligated to act on that information and turn those people over to immigration authorities. I don't think that they claim that this is their legal obligation. I don't accept that's true. I think they're quite wrong. Police officers exercise discretion in their work every single day. They don't ticket every speeder. They don't arrest every time they see an offense. They make decisions in the public interest about whether they should proceed with a charge at that time. And it has to function that way or the system wouldn't work. One example I'd like to give also is immigration is a civil status. It's not criminal. And a comparable example is the Employment Standards Act. This is a civil system. The police don't see it as their job to arrest every employer who fails to pay employees the wages they're entitled to. Why do they make such a big deal about what is different about immigration to them that they feel it's their job to enforce what is a civil system, and which we have immigration officers there to do that? Society has an interest in encouraging victims and witnesses of crimes to come forward for protection. This policy is against public safety, and it makes women more vulnerable. And I think we've come a long way. As I've said, there's still a lot of work to do. Without having a full don't ask and don't tell policy with the board, what that means is that people without status in this city and this country do not have the same access to equal protection and benefit of the law.